everybody. It is Misty Doan and welcome to Missouri Star Live. I hope you're having a fabulous Tuesday. As always, it is so wonderful to spend a little bit of the week with you. Thank you so much for being here. Let's see where we have people tuning in from. Amy from New Hampshire, Louisa from Brazil, Linda from Gray Summit, Missouri. I don't know where Gray Summit is, but it can't be too far. Nice to have someone in our home state. Haiti from California. Thank you guys so much for being here and spending your Tuesday with us. We really, really appreciate it, and we hope that you're having a good day and a good week and all are staying safe and well. We're just going to kind of kick back and take it easy today. We've got some really fun things we're going to cover about cutting and rotary cutters and all things cutting 101, I guess. But we're here to I'm happy to take questions that you might have on that subject. So let us know in the comments and Liz will send those my way. And yeah, hopefully we just have a nice, easygoing time today. So thank you so much for being here and let me know what I can answer for you. Now to start off with, I do want to answer just a couple of questions. First of all, I've had quite a few of you saying, "Where is Jake?" And I'm so thankful that you are asking about him, and he says hello. He is home with the kiddos. During this time of quarantine and homeschool, we're all just adjusting a little bit, and he's taking this time and spending it with the kids. And it's going really well, and he's having so much fun working in the garden and doing great manly projects and just loving it. So he says hello. Thank you so much for checking on him, and we love you. So thank you. Also, we've had quite a few questions about when the shops will reopen in town. And you might have seen that we did put a post out yesterday that says our shops are still closed indefinitely until further notice. And obviously we don't plan to stay closed forever. We hope to open as soon as we can safely. But remember, our online shop is always open, and we love you and appreciate you so much for shopping with us. And you can continue to do so. Just a little reminder with all of this crazy times, there is some delays with our shipping, which we're trying so hard to get caught up on, but just be aware. Right now, if you order fabric by the yard, that takes a little bit longer to get ready because we have our amazing warehouse staff out there working like crazy, but also keeping safe and distancing from one another. And so it's just a little bit longer of a process than we're used to. And so if you order or place an order with fabric by the yard, it's going to take about 10 to 15 days to ship. It's not what we want, but it's where we are, and we just have to go with it. And we just want you to understand where we're at. So we're working to improve that, but that's what you can expect. If you don't have fabric by the yard in your order, you can expect it to take about 3 to 5 to 6 days, somewhere in there. So not too terribly long, but we all just kind of have to adjust our expectations a little bit, and we appreciate your patience. If it's been longer than that and you haven't received an order, please reach out to customer service. They will answer all your questions and take fabulous care of you. So hopefully that covers all of that from the beginning. And then now let's see if we have any cutting questions, and let's get started.
So we do have one question, and it's from, sorry, I missed your name. It went by too fast. I'm going to come back to you, but it's, when do I actually need to change up my cutting mat?
Oh, okay. That's a really good question. So for me, with my cutting mat, I tend to cut in the same places over and over and over again. And so eventually you'll find a little ridge kind of gets built into your cutting mat. And so when you go to cut, if you are using your rotary cutter and you have a fresh blade and you've done all the things with your rotary cutter that you know to do, but you're still missing threads or missing chunks of your cut, your rotary mat is probably worn out. Now, if you're not ready to splurge on a new mat, you can force yourself to kind of move where you're cutting, and it will prolong the life of your mat. It's not going to look as pretty because you're going to have those worn out lines. They say they're self-healing, but they're only self-healing for so long. Eventually, they just wear out. They're plastic. And so I think you just have to kind of have that expectation. But definitely, if you're getting missed threads a lot from the space that you're cutting consistently, either shift where you're cutting or get yourself a new mat. So that's a great question.
Phyllis wants to know, do I have to cut the pinked edges off my pre-cuts?
Absolutely not, Phyllis. You do not need to cut the pinked edges off unless they absolutely make you crazy. But for the most part, I always leave mine on. And the reason being is if you go and cut the pinked edges off of, say this pre-cut I have here is Robert Kaufman. I can't remember, but I think they measure, because they have the smaller pinked edge, I believe they measure all the way to the outside of the peak. So to get your 5 inches and to have it be accurate, you actually need to go all the way out to the point. So if you cut it off, your square is not going to be exactly 5 inches anymore. So that's important to know. And then Moda, they measure from the inside of the peak to the inside of the peak. So you technically could cut that off for 5 inches. But what I tend to do is I just think it's important to pick one that you're going to follow and use that as your guide. And so, you know, maybe you're using a Moda print with a Kona background and they have different pinked edges. Just choose one and then make sure you follow that edge throughout your whole project, but there's no need to cut it off. That would be just not effective and would defeat the whole purpose of our pre-cuts, and it helps it stop from fraying even in the project once you've sewn it together. So I like that staying there.
I've heard some people say, Kelly says, I've heard some people say you should always use your ruler for cutting before using lines on the mat because the ruler is more accurate. Is that true?
So this is a great question. Liz and I were actually just talking about this before we went live. And I would say as a general rule, that is true. Because of how rulers are made, they're less likely to warp or, you know, wear off even, especially our rulers that are etched in. You know, the paint's not going to wear off. These markings stay and are true. But that being said, I don't necessarily think it's super important to go one way or the other. It's just important to be consistent throughout your project. So if it's more comfortable for you to use the markings on your mat as a guide, that's totally okay. Just do it throughout the whole quilt because then you know your cuts are going to be the same. And the same goes with your ruler. So if you're going to cut all your strips with your ruler, make sure you do that for the whole quilt and don't switch halfway and use your cutting mat as a guide because they're going to be a little bit different. So just like Jenny says, you know, with your 1/4 inch, it doesn't really matter if it's perfectly exact. It matters that it's consistent throughout your whole project, and cutting is the same way.
So Pinky Jones wants to know, speaking of rulers, how do you cut or hold the ruler to keep it from sliding?
Okay, that's a great question. So let's just, I'll show you how I do it. First of all, I liked to stand when I cut. I actually had a question in here. We printed a few off beforehand, and one of them says, do you have to stand when you cut? You don't have to. For me, I can see better what I'm doing and make sure that my ruler is straight, and I like the angle with my rotary cutter. And so I choose to do the majority of my cutting, especially if I'm cutting a lot of sashing or borders. Instead of quick little cuts, I'm gonna do that standing just because it's more comfortable for me, but also the height of your table plays a part in that. You wanna make sure that you're comfortable and you have the right angle. So let me just go ahead and grab, actually let's get a 10-inch square. We'll just pull one out of here. And then this ruler fits exactly on our 10-inch square, so I can just line it up on the side if I wanna cut this in half. And then for me, when I have my ruler lined up on the fabric, you can see I'm using it. My fabric is wonky on the mat. I'm using the ruler as a guide. I'm going to have like 2 or 3 fingers actually on the ruler itself, holding it down, and the other 2 off the ruler to make sure, sorry, had my cutter open, living dangerously. I'm going to have the other 2 off on the mat or on the rest of the fabric to ensure that my ruler doesn't slip. And that just gives me a little extra grip. And then I also kind of spread out my fingers, but make sure that it's away from the edge because we don't want any accidents. So I just hold it just like so. And then it's super easy and I don't have to worry about the ruler slipping. But again, it's all about kind of body dynamics and making sure that you have the right amount of pressure on your ruler and not pressing too hard against it with your rotary cutter. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, Liz, anything else?
Yeah. Does it matter if you're right or left-handed? We know Jenny's left-handed. You're
Yeah.
right-handed. Does
Okay.
that change the way you do things?
So it can change it a little bit, and especially if, like, even now, I've watched Jenny quilt for so long. There is like a lot of times, I can't even tell you, that I will just take the ruler and line it up on this side of the fabric. And that, if you're left-handed, that's, you know, setting you up for success, because now you've got your ruler over here and you can use your rotary cutter in your left hand. I am right-handed. So even though I know this, sometimes when we see other people do things visually, we think we have to do it exactly the same. But for me, it's way more comfortable for my ruler to be over on this side of the fabric and to cut with my right hand. Now, that being said, you can do it the other way. There's tricks to get around it, you know, especially if you're one who lines up using your mat. You can kind of get away with a little bit different because, for example, say I'm making a 3-inch cut. I've got this lined up on the mat. I can go 1, 2, 3, put my ruler there, and I'm still good to go. And so I'm working from the other side. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but I think just if it feels hard in your brain, think about how you're working with your ruler on the fabric, because it should be pretty natural. It shouldn't feel uncomfortable when you're cutting. If it does, you're probably maybe cutting like a left-handed person if you're right-handed, or right-handed if you're left-handed. Just allow yourself to switch it up a bit. It's a good question.
Thanks. And Angela asks, my blade often leaves skip spots. I have to go over and over my cut. Am I pushing too hard and damaging my blade?
Okay, so there's a very good possibility. I actually think a lot of people press too hard with the rotary cutter. If your blade is sharp and good enough, you should not have to press crazy hard. It's literally a razor blade on here. And so it should cut cleanly through your fabric, especially if you don't have too many layers. So if you are leaving skipped threads and if you have nicks in your your rotary blade, it's time to change it. Switch it out for sure. It's just not worth it. And especially if you ever accidentally cut over a pin, or even take a big nick out of your ruler, because these things happen. All of those things will leave marks in your rotary blades, and then they're not going to be as accurate and sharp as you want them to be. And honestly, that's when injuries happen. So that's when it's time to just let that one go and put a new blade in there so that you're not pushing too hard, because pushing too hard, that's also when you can slip and cut yourself. It's just not worth the risk. So let that blade go, put a new one in there.
And that's a good question. Nylene and several others are asking, when do you go ahead and change your blade? So that's one of the times.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you are feeling like you're having to work too hard to get it to cut for you, it is probably time to get a new blade. And that's always the first step, is to say, you know what, I've skipped threads 3 cuts in a row. It's time to just switch it up and put a new blade in there. One of the reasons I actually love this rotary cutter is because it's easy to change the blades. This is the Olfa Splash. Jenny also loves it because it's for both right and left hands. It's comfortable for, you know, either grip. And it's my favorite as well. But changing the blade on this is super, super simple. Whereas some of the other ones you have to unscrew. This is actually just a click and it drops off. You can see there. You just want to be really, really careful. And then you just remove that and put your new blade on. But it is just really quick to change. So it's one of the reasons I like it. I don't dread changing my blade with this rotary cutter.
What do you do with your old blades, Misty?
That's a good question. It's important to, however you're going to dispose of those old blades, to just make sure that you're being responsible and you're putting it in some type of container so that it's not going to cut whoever takes out the trash or comes in contact with that. We just want to make sure that we're keeping people safe. So there's lots of different options. You can put it in a little cardboard box and keep it, contained in there. You can wrap it with tape. I actually, when you buy new blades, they come in a container like this. And when I emptied that first set of blades, I took a Sharpie and wrote "old" on it. And that's what I store my old blades in. And then I know this one's old and I have a new pack of my new blades. And That way I don't have to worry about it. And when this is full, I can just toss this whole thing in the trash and I know that no one's gonna get cut. So that's my favorite method, but really you just wanna make sure that you're being safe and wrapping it up or tucking it in something so that nobody's gonna get cut. Anything else? Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's go over, one of the questions that came through was, why aren't my cuts straight when I cut my own strips? And I think this is a question that we hear a lot. So I'm actually gonna pull up some yardage here and we can talk a little bit about that.
And we've got a couple comments here too. People are saying, I use the old ones to cut paper. So that's
yes, I've heard that as well. A lot of people who do scrapbooking or card making use their old blades for cutting paper, which is so smart. I think once you discover the awesomeness of a rotary cutter, you're like, why don't people use these for everything? They're so great and so handy. It's hard to go back to scissors for craft projects when you have a rotary cutter in your arsenal, that's for sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cutting strips. Move some of this out of the way. I just have some yardage here. Now I have heard every different rule under the sun about cutting strips. A lot of people swear that when you cut your strips, you want to have it open as large as you can to avoid elbows. I just have never run into that as long as I take the time to make sure that I'm cutting properly. So the first step is I want to make sure that there are not any major wrinkles in my fabric when it was rolled onto the bolt. I want to make sure it's nice and smooth, and then I'm going to start with the fold towards me, and I'm going to fold it up in half again. This is my method of cutting. And if I were to get all the way over here, you can see there's a little wrinkle in here. I would go ahead and press that out just because it will, if you cut over that, you're going to get a little dog leg, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to make sure this is nice and straight. And then I do line it up. This is one of those times that I tend to use my mat over my ruler to measure. I don't know why. If I'm cutting on my quilt block or doing smaller piecing cuts, I always use my ruler. But when I'm cutting strips, I like to use my mat. And again, you can see if I were using my ruler, I would probably orient this the other way. But because I'm going to use my mat, it's okay, and I can use the markings as measurement. So I've got this lined up across this inch line. I'm going to make sure it's nice and straight. And I always just kind of run my finger along it and make sure when I press down, it still looks straight on my mat. And then I'm going to start by truing up this edge. Oops. See, I just talked about if you're not able to cut all the way through, it might be time to change this blade. There we go. All right. And so now I have a nice straight line here and a nice straight line here. I know it's nice and square. And so I'm just going to come over, and let's say I need to cut 2.5 inch strips. And I use the markings on my mat to line up with my ruler in this case to make sure that it's staying nice and square. I also check here on my fabric, I don't know if you guys can see this, to make sure this is still nice and straight, using all the markings I can to make sure it is as accurate as possible, because you get those elbows that appear if your ruler is just slightly crooked. I mean, it can just be a little bit off, but if you make sure that you're nice and straight, you won't have any of that trouble. So now I've got that good to go. I can cut, and then I can open this up. I don't have any elbows. It's nice and straight. So that is how I cut my strips. Like I said, there's a million different ways people tout as being the correct way, but I think it's just important to find what works for you and take the time, especially when you're cutting yardage, to really make sure that it's smooth and straight, because that's what's going to set you up for success.
Thanks, Misty. And
yeah,
when you are cutting, if you do get that elbow, it's not the end of the world, right?
Absolutely not.
Hide it in that 1/4 inch seam.
Absolutely, almost always, unless you get like really wonky and you open it up and it's like, you know, almost looks like a W or something, then you know I'm probably going to have to let that piece go. But for the most part, if those variations are just slight, you can hide that in the 1/4 inch seam. And that happens with all of our cutting, right? If we are just, you know, 1/8 of an inch off, we know for sure we can kind of float that and make it fit in the 1/4 inch seam. And that's really all we need as quilters is to make sure it will fit in the seam. And we can hide some of our cutting mistakes that way.
Can you show us how to change that blade?
Yes, absolutely.
And then also, is there a wrong side of a blade? I know there's right and wrong side of fabric. Is there a right and wrong side
That's
of a
a
blade?
great question. Do you know, Liz?
I think you can use both sides. So
I
Maria
think
asked
so
this
too.
question, and someone else had said earlier, you can flip it over before you dispose of it.
See,
So-
that's what I was going to say. I've actually heard of that people say when you, like for example, so here's our Olfa, and I'm actually just going to do this right on the mat so that we don't have any risk of cutting ourselves. This is the way I recommend. So it just pops that out just like so, and then we can very carefully lift that blade off. And so I know that this blade is old. I actually only have one blade left in my container. So then I can mark this as my old container when we're done. Oops, if I can open it. And again, very carefully, I have that new blade. And if you look closely at it, you can tell that it's sharp on both sides. So it's almost like a knife's edge right on the edge of the blade. And so that's why I think it really is reversible. And like Liz said, it's okay to kind of flip it over in the rotary cutter. So I could actually take this one, just flip it over and see if it gives it new life or helps it, you know, last a little bit longer. There are also sharpeners for your rotary blades. It will prolong the life. It's not going to be like a new blade. Never. A new blade is always going to be better. So here we have our new blade. I'm actually just going to pop this on here and flip it over. And then I can just sit this back on here and then push this up, and that grips it just like that. And it's ready to go. And so that is how I do that. And then I very carefully, so we don't want to cut ourselves, can put that old one in here. And if I have a Sharpie, I do have a purple one, we'll just label that as old. And then I know when this is in the drawer with my sewing supplies and things that this is where I can hide or stash all of my old blades until this is full, and then I can safely dispose of them. So hopefully that answered all of those questions about changing out the blade. Anything else coming through?
Yeah, when you do that, sometimes it's still cutting weird, and we know that
Okay.
Misty knows where I'm going with this. So
Yes.
sometimes you can get 2 blades when you're trying to get 1 blade.
Exactly. That actually happens more than you would think. People will, like I've heard from so many people, I cannot get this to work. I put a new blade in, it's still cutting crazy. I'm getting these little frayed edges when I cut. And usually when that happens, there are 2 blades stuck together, and you've actually put 2 blades in your rotary cutter. So if that's happening to you and you're confused, like definitely take it off and look again. Because of how the rotary blades come, there's kind of an oil that coats them to keep them fresh and sharp, and they stick together if you're not careful. And so you do want to make sure carefully, again, they're very sharp, that they're not stuck together. And if that, for some reason, if you check that they're not stuck together and it's still cutting bad, then it might be time for a new rotary cutter. Sometimes they just wear out and they don't spin as smoothly. There's things that can go wrong, but for the most part, changing a blade is the ticket.
And Sue's asking, how do you manage the oiliness on a new blade?
So I don't worry too much about it, Sue. I just change the blade. I've never had it leave a mark on my fabric or anything like that. That's one of those cases where I kind of trust the manufacturer that it's there for a purpose and it's necessary for it to work as well as it can. So I don't ever try to wipe it off or even worry about it. I just put on my new blade and trust that it's going to do the job that I need it to do. Hopefully that answers.
And then can you tell us about why you have different sizes of rotary cutters?
Absolutely. So I actually have a few different sizes here. The go-to for most quilters is this 45 mil. It cuts easily through, I would say, 4 to 6 layers of fabric comfortably. Once you get much thicker than that, that's when you tend to get some shifting and wonkiness. But for your everyday regular use, the 45 will do just about everything you need it to. I love the 60 millimeter. It's a little bit bigger. It's a heavier duty. And the reason I love it is because I'm a lazy cutter. And so if I want to cut a lot of strips or a lot of layers quickly, you can cut easily through 8 or 10 layers of fabric with a 60 millimeter cutter. It just glides through it because of the larger blade. You don't have to work so hard. And so if you find yourself with a 45 layering lots and lots of fabric and having to push really hard to cut through it because you're determined to speed it up and get more fabric for each cut, it might be a good idea to upgrade to a 60. Once I figured that out, I was like, this is genius. So I think that's a pro tip. It's also really great if you're working with like cuddle or heavier fabrics. It's just made for a little bit heavier duty cutting, which is really, really handy to know. There's also 28 millimeter cutters, and these smaller cutters are kind of made to help you when you're dealing with curves. Let me show you here. I've got this little charm square, and here's my orange peel template. And then we can just use this. Oops, hold on. Make sure I've got it the right way. There we go. We can just use this little 28 mil. This one in particularly is pressure based, so you don't actually have to slide the guard off. As you press down, it will just cut. And then because it's smaller, it glides right around that curve. Whoops. There we go. And it just makes that nice and smooth. With most of our templates, you can still easily do this with a 45. I've never had a problem. I actually don't have one of these smaller cutters in my home sewing room, but maybe that is just because I'm a make-do girl. It's also great for applique projects if you have a lot of tracing that you've done and that you need to cut out. It's just easier to maneuver smaller, tighter curves with the smaller rotary cutters. So that's a great tool to have as well. So there are even smaller ones that are out there, and those are for like really fine detail. But these are the three that you see most often and kind of what they're used for.
Do you have any tricks for making sure you don't cut towards yourself?
Okay, that's another good question. Don't do it. That's my number one trick. But also remember that you are not stuck in one place. So when you're cutting, if you have a shape or you're working with your ruler and you cut this way and then you need to turn, like for some reason our brains do crazy things and we're tempted to cut this way. Courtney actually shared this really great tip. I don't know if you saw when she was teaching the kaleidoscope quilt. She shared how when you have that triangle ruler and you go to cut the other direction, she'll actually place another ruler this way and then take this one out, and then you can safely cut this direction away from you, which I thought that was so genius. I don't know why I had never thought of that, but you can use the ruler where it's supposed to be as a guide, then slide another ruler up there to make your cut. Pull this one out of the way. You can also use a rotating cutting mat. If you don't have a rotating mat, Jenny often says any small mat will do. You can take any cutting mat, have your project here. And if you're making a cut and again you need to turn and make another cut, you can just lift your mat and turn it until it's oriented the way that you need it. And look, this whole mat rotates just how you need it without it actually being a rotating mat. So there's lots and lots of options, but just make sure you're not cutting towards yourself. It's not worth the risk. And there's so many ways to work around it that are much safer.
And we had a shout out too that 60 millimeter is also really good for cutting batting.
Yes, absolutely. It's great for cutting batting. If you are doing the, our cute little hexagons, the Quilt As You Go hexagons that we did for our first triple play last year, I had to cut a lot of batting hexagons, and you can bet your bottom dollar I was really grateful for this 60 millimeter because I could cut through multiple layers of batting. I really pushed it to its limit, which we'll be honest, but it worked. It worked great, and they were accurate and worked wonderfully for the project. So that's a great tip.
And then we have another couple of comments. Cream Puff Creation says, I try to work on the corner of my table so I can use either side.
Yes, that's smart.
So that's a good option. And then also Deb Gossin says, I have more control with the 28 millimeter cutter. I use that size most of the time because I have smaller hands and other sizes are bulky.
I think that's such a good thing to point out. Deb was her name, right? Thanks for pointing that out, Deb. Liz and I were actually talking about that yesterday. You know, I'm tall. I have kind of big hands, long fingers, so I'm comfortable using these larger cutters. But for people who are smaller in stature, more petite, you're exactly right. It's probably not going to be as comfortable for you. And so use what feels right and feels safe in your hand. And you'll know if it feels cumbersome, it's probably not the right tool for you.
And then one more great tip from April Baker Coombs. I hope I'm saying her name right. She says, I'm in a wheelchair and I have to sit to cut. I use a weighted ball for exercising to hold the other end of my ruler. I hope that helps someone.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I've seen lots of people use that, even little hand weights. They'll put on the opposite side of their ruler to keep it straight, and then they can hold closer to themselves and still cut safely. That's a great tip. Thank you so much.
And then we have time for just another couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. You can keep asking questions if you're not watching this live.
Yes.
And we will get back to those questions.
Absolutely. We'll answer you in the comments.
Yes. So one question is, does anyone use the non-slip ruler grips? Is there anything you do to the ruler to make it not slip around?
So that's a good question. Lots of people love them, and it's a great product. And for me, I like my ruler to move. It drives me crazy to have the grips on it. I tried it because I was like, oh, that's a great idea. You know, then your ruler doesn't slip when you cut, but I felt like I had to work so much harder. And this is just me. I just felt like I had to work so much harder to get my ruler where I wanted it to go. And so for me, I'm not a huge fan, but there are so many people that love it. Especially if you're a new quilter, I think it kind of gives you a sense of control that when you put your ruler where you want it, it's gonna stay there for you. And you don't have to necessarily have your grip just right when you go to cut. I think it's one of those things that you have to test out and see if it works for you. Like I said, for me, I tried it, I didn't love it, but I know so many quilters who do. So don't be afraid to give it a shot, and you might find that it is very helpful for you.
Okay, and then I think the last question we have, and it's come up a couple of times, is what about ergonomic handles? Are there handles you recommend for people who might have mild arthritis or other dexterity difficulties?
There are lots of different ergonomic styles that are available. We were actually hoping to show some of the different cutters, but we're having such a hard time keeping things in stock right now with everything that's going on. And so we didn't want to show you something and then you not be able to buy it. So all I have are these three that I've been using regularly. But again, I think it's kind of one of those things that you have to see how it feels in your hand. And so I don't tend to like there's a lot of the ones that you just squeeze to release the blade and you squeeze while you cut. Those just kill my hands. They make me hurt and they make me tired of sewing. And I'm like, okay, I don't need this to be any more difficult. This is something I love to do. So I know that that style of cutters doesn't work for me. I know a lot of people who can never remember to close their blade, and so that's the only style of cutter they're willing to use. And so I think you just kind of have to, again, see what works best for you. To be totally honest, this is the rotary cutter I use, so I haven't really tried the ergonomic grip myself. And I'm a little afraid because I just really like this one. It works for me. And so maybe if all of a sudden it doesn't feel so comfortable in my hand, that's something that I would try. But it's so nice. A lot of times when you go to your local quilt shops, they'll have a variety of tools that you can actually, hold and test and see what works for you. So I recommend doing that.
Okay, so speaking of cutting, we've had lots of comments about how your hair looks great today.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks for sharing all of your information about cutting and all of its different
Absolutely.
varieties.
Happy to help. Well, this is my wild, crazy natural hair. I don't let it free very often because it has a mind of its own, but I appreciate all of the kind words. It's just a little wild. I could manage it today. There was taming. Sometimes it gets real big, and yeah.
So as we close out here, can you tell us one more time, your favorite is that Olfa Splash?
Yes, my favorite rotary cutter is the Olfa Splash. Again, it works for both right or left-handed. It also has the quick change for your blade. It's just a great, great rotary cutter.
And that's the aqua, but it comes in several colors.
It does. I have it in pink at home, and I actually think, let me look here. Oh yes, we have a navy. Oh yeah, lots of options. I thought we had a pink too, but I don't see it. But it comes in several different colors. They all work exactly the same. It's just whatever suits you. They're great cutter. I love it. So hopefully this answered some of your questions. Like Liz said, if anything else comes through or comes to mind, feel free to leave it in the comments, and either someone from our team or me will try and pop through and answer some of those later in the day. Also, I forgot to mention, but this is just kind of fun that we included. We have this free coloring page that says measure twice, cut once, which is all, really good advice that we all need to remember, especially in quilting, because when we have beautiful fabric, we don't want to make mistakes with our cuts. We want it to be right. So make sure you double check yourself, take some time and color this cute page, and it could look adorable in your sewing room. And have a fabulous week, and we will see you soon. Thank you, guys.